Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be on this amazing panel, and I'm looking forward to this this conversation. Before I begin, just a little word of warning. I'm going to be really provocative. Okay, so I'm treating this as actually a seminar of a lot of people, and so don't take what I'm saying as necessarily the case, but I'm going to make some arguments that I hope can generate a conversation. Okay, so please take it in that context. And with that, I will begin by recognizing at a broad level that there is this tension in our field, our approach to policy studies, between explanatory and applied policy analysis, right? We have this constant tension between just describing and explaining the policy world, which by itself is fantastic and important, but most of us have some kind of idea about perhaps taking this knowledge to improve problems in some way. Most of us do, I think. And in fact, there's a history of this in our discipline, right? From Simon to Lasswell to Lindblom, right? These folks cared about the actual world, as we all do. And of course, Ostrom is one of the latest to think carefully about a specific kind of problem and to work backwards to think about that theoretically and practically, and then win a Nobel Prize in economics for doing that, right? So we have this tradition of doing both, for sure. And I even think, you know, we can ask the question, do we have a moral responsibility when thinking about climate change about actually having to take our explanatory work and then translating it into an applied component? I think that's a fair question to ask given the nature of the crises that we're facing. We use the word crisis a lot in our discipline, you know, but this is a true catastrophe about to unyield itself, right? We're getting warmer faster, and we know that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 300 years, right? So we know that scientifically, this crisis at some point can't be averted. And we know that the impacts are multitude and pervasive, right? From icebergs crashing off to increasing forest fires to even now presently the bleaching of the coral reefs. And that's just three of like a million examples, right, about these impacts. So this is a crisis, and I suspect that we have a moral responsibility to think about these problems, especially when we take into account that they're coinciding along with what is known as the sixth great extinction of the planet is happening right now. You have the honor of living through this phenomenon, okay? And it's the first one created by Homo sapiens, okay? So we've done it. We've created, and it's a million. Can you imagine that in your brain? A million species are being threatened with extinction. Not one or two, but a million. It's so abstract, right? A million, and we've done it. Okay, we're responsible for it, right? So I thought I'd give you some visualizations of these, you know, 2 out of the million, okay? So one is this sage grouse in the U.S. South, which, owing to privatization of land, has led to a lack of ecosystems in a very unique part of the habitat that it requires. And here's the orangutan in Borneo, right? We're about to lose the orangutan, despite having invented around 25 different policy interventions, usually market mechanisms, over the last 25 years, and we're going to lose it. Why are we going to lose it? There's this thing called palm oil that shows up in most of the things that you eat and wear, okay? And so think about this for a second, okay? Think about this for a second, that these kindergartners that you all know, maybe they're even your children, right? When they eat Oreo cookies, right, they're causing the orangutan to become extinct, okay? These little kids are doing this to our planet, right? Cute little kids are destroying the orangutan, right? So the complexities of responsibilities are very strong. This is not an Indonesian or Malaysian problem. This is a global problem that we're responsible for consumption and production. So the puzzle, I think, is, you know, we love puzzles in our world. So the puzzle, I think, is, one puzzle is, we've known this for a long time, right? What's happening, like for 25, 30 years and even more. We've known this. And yet, the problems are getting worse. And the United Nations is one of the leading bodies to coalesce the knowledge around these problems and to develop rhetorical flourishes about how important they actually are. 12 years left, we hear, I've been hearing 12 years left for a while, but it's increasingly getting acute such that that really is the case, right? So they're worsening. So why are they worsening, and why are all of our efforts that we're throwing at these problems not capable of addressing these crises? So I got two hypotheses, okay? So the first one's going to be on the one that I think a lot of us probably love, power, right? So powerful interests probably don't want us to really address the problems if they come against the idea of economic growth and strong challenges to utility and all these things that we know and love, right? If that's the case, who's winning in the power dimension? And I would argue, I posit that the World Economic Forum is doing just great when it comes to the power question, right? And they've got more problem definitions than simply the orangutan or the climate crisis. And even the World Business Council is trying to balance different objectives in ways that may not be able to get us to these problem-solving challenges, but they've been heavily involved, these two, in creating most of the policy interventions that have been applied the last 25 years. Who's not winning? I was thinking about that. Well, NRDC, not so much. Greenpeace, not at all. They're not winning at all. And nor is this girl, okay? You know her? Greta Thunberg, okay? From Sweden, who actually individually said to all of us, what are we doing, right? And how can we make a difference? And she's being a provocative voice and trying to get the crisis that is facing us to be at the forefront, right? The Baumgartner and Jones punctuated agenda setting, right, is caused by her. But she's not winning, right? She's not winning. And in fact, the powerful interests often try and co-opt rhetorically those who aren't winning, right? So the rhetoric is actually around the problem-solving stuff. But the interventions aren't even close to the rhetoric, right? They're just disconnected from each other. And so that's one hypothesis that probably has some merit, but now I'm going to get really awkward, okay? And I'm going to say actually a second hypothesis is actually us, okay, as a community. Okay, this is really going to get awkward, okay? And I'm going to argue that actually our problem conceptions about the nature of the problem itself have not been worked out enough by us and our explanatory, descriptive, and prescriptive efforts. And they've led to a drift in how we think about the problems that we're facing and the solutions that we might offer them. So I want to argue that, well, huge strides have been made in thinking about anticipatory policy design. We've had a lot of workshops in this conference about that. And even on policy baskets and mixes, we're really doing great on that. There's been a failure to make these findings contingent on very distinct problem conceptions. I want to argue that we're trying to generalize across all problem types, and we cannot do that. And that could, in fact, be part of the reasons why we're having these challenges. And in fact, by trying to generalize across all problem types has led our community, and this is getting really awkward, to make erroneous conclusions about how we use qualitative and quantitative methods and how we bring different disciplines together. I'm going to make this point in my talk, okay? And our preferences for applied policy analysis techniques, which I'm going to argue, inadvertently prioritize some problem conceptions over others, and it's not the climate change one, okay? That's my argument, okay? So here it goes, now that it's all really, really awkward, how am I going to elaborate this? So I'm going to argue there's actually 4 problem types out there, not one, okay? And I did this table because I had this kind of crisis the last few years about my own work on market-driven governance. I kind of thought, you know, it kind of coalesced when there was this president elected, okay, where I work in the United States. And I got thinking, am I actually part of the problem of influencing policy design around market mechanisms as being innovative and productive and efficient, but actually perhaps not addressing problems? And so I got to think, and I did a lot of paper writing, and I reflected on the different problem conceptions out there in our world, and I thought that 2 questions really could help us think about disentangling very different problem conceptions. Of course, this is the 2x2 table, which we have to have anyway in an article as a norm, right? So I have the 2x2 table. But this one, I think it works. So one question is, does a problem conception reinforce some kind of economic logic or some kind of utility logic, a rational choice approach to thinking about behavior? Okay, we all know how this works in our discipline. And secondly, does the management technique that's being offered to address the problem, is it meant to, is it derived from a certain class of problems, or is it meant to apply to any problem at all, okay? Now this sounds abstract, but at least 4 different ways of seeing how our world works in the applied part. So I want to argue that type 1, okay, this is economic rationales dominate, but only for a particular class of problems, captures Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning endeavors. Her problem conception, and in her first chapter of governing the commons, very clear, she's got an economic problem where human beings are rationally overharvesting a resource to the point that they will actually become depleted. But it's rational to do so because if you don't overharvest the resource, be it timber or fish or grasslands, your neighbor will. So you may as well get a short-term benefit, given there's no long-term benefit, you're all going to lose, right? And so the issue for her is working backwards, given that problem, how do you design an approach to making us not harvest more than the growth rate, right? And so she wins a Nobel Prize for identifying a third option that goes beyond public ownership or privatization to look at common pool resources to institutions, and works for 30 years on this question, but only on this class of problem. And what I want to argue is that what's happened in the environmental field is that over time, the Ostrom model, which got a lot of traction, moved to be applied to any kind of problem through traditional cost-benefit analysis that we all know and aware of in this community, which we call win-lose optimization, where social welfare economics or cost-benefit calculations are applied to see whether a problem can be addressed. So you know the whole deal. You got a problem, whatever it is, and you apply some kind of innovation, and you assess the innovation on the basis of whether or not it enhances social welfare. And so the answer as to whether you can address the problem you care about is dependent upon whether social welfare increases or decreases. And if you can't find a solution where social welfare increases, you can't solve the problem. And so you get a nice answer, scientifically rigorous, quantitative answer about how to address this problem, okay? Or whether you can address this problem, which means that you never know whether you can address the climate crisis or the orangutan unless you get creative. And this leads to debates about discount rates. It leads to willingness to pay surveys to try and bring the environment into an economic framework, right? And this has been the story of climate governance for most of the last 30 years, okay? Discount rates are winning, economic rationales are important, and humans' social welfare is the priority here, okay? So I want to skip over to type 3 and say, another approach emerges that's, I think, common in our field is the win-lose compromise approach, where multi-goal policy analysis or multi-stakeholder dispute resolution processes in an applied sense are brought to the table. You balance environmental and social with economic goals, and you get some kind of decision about how to proceed over a policy problem. But you don't know if that problem can be really solved until after the deliberation is run. This is the point of democracy and inclusion. You don't know, right? So we apply this a lot to see if problems can be solved or not, and we get the answer on the basis of whether or not the stakeholder bodies end up deciding what they decide. And so the example I often refer to illustrate this one is actually the case of Newfoundland, right? Where the scientists told Newfoundland fishers that you're overharvesting these fish, and therefore you have to stop it, right? And so they engaged in stakeholder processes to include municipalities, workers, fishers, and so on. And they got a wonderful, trustable, open, transparent agreement about how to proceed. Now, it wasn't in line with the science of the fisheries depletion, but it was a wonderful agreement that met all of our needs about legitimacy and trust and authority. And of course, you know what happened. The species collapsed, right? So it was the wrong approach for some kinds of problems. So what I want to argue is that type 4 problems, win-lose prioritization, are actually the proper metaphor for thinking about the climate crisis and the orangutans. And this is where some problems are so important, either normatively or based on the science, that you cannot compromise if you want to address them. You must first address them, and then you can do other things after that, right? So the science of biodiversity loss is very clear. That orangutan needs a natural habitat in the Borneo jungle. So if you decide to compromise and only give it 5%, it's going to become extinct, right? So the only thing you can do if you want to save the orangutan is to find out what the science is on the orangutan habitat and then try and achieve that conservation goal, not change it, right? But we're not doing that in today's world on either climate or biodiversity loss. We're trying to find type 2 solutions, and we're undermining type 4, okay? So I want to walk us through a bit more of the type 4 one to really reinforce why I think type 4 is where we ought to be placing a lot more of our attention as scholars in the policy process, okay? So within type 4, we've, with my former doctoral student, Kelly Levin, Graham Auld, who's now the policy director at Carleton's Policy School, and Stephen Bernstein developed this notion of super wicked problems. So this is your diagram to get that visualized in your head, okay? Superman and then a play in London together, super wicked, okay? Not just wicked, which you know, Riddle Weber's famous article, this is super wicked, okay? And so just like, and so this is like just showing you, it was 2007 was the first paper, and then more papers after that. But the point here is that like Ostrom, we think you ought to work backwards from the nature of the problem itself to think about your applied solution based on this class of problems. And so we said, you know, there are actually 4 features. By the way, that's owing to my wife, that graphic. Thank her for that moving clock. That's pretty awesome, right? Time is running out. At some point, it's too late to act, given this that the carbon sits in the atmosphere for 300 years, right? Secondly, no central authority, no one place to go to resolve the problem. This one's tough. Those seeking to end the problem is also causing it. If we drew a line around all of us and we said, okay, you're a country, we'd be the highest emitting country in the world because academics love to fly and go to conferences and we love to care about the world, right? And so we're walking contradictions. It's with ourselves, this one, okay, which is tough. And then finally, the policy responses are irrational. We don't mean the economist version of hyperbolic discounting being irrational. We mean irrational based on the climate science. The 1 million species, that's irrational, okay? The catastrophic ecological effects we're not coming close to addressing, right? So when these 4 things exist, and they do in the climate case, we say, therefore work backwards from that to think about solutions. So we actually agree with Ostrom to go work backwards, unlike types 2 and 3, but it's a different kind of problem. And therefore it's not an Ostrom problem. The metaphor of reflective action, which comes from Ostrom, that framed type 2, is the wrong metaphor for thinking about these problems that we're facing. Instead, we argue that path dependency analysis is a much better metaphor, which, as we know, in this community, has now been given a lot of attention on this case, right? So we actually are, you know, at the forefront of path dependency in this regard, right? And this is because path dependency thinks about constraining our short-term economic interests to our long-term ecological concerns. We care about the world beyond our own utility, right? But we always have a problem with the fact that our short-term interventions don't align with our long-term moral values, right? So path dependency is one way to do that, especially the notion of critical junctures, where you create these critical junctures on purpose and they steer you in the future towards a low-carbon pathway that might actually address this climate crisis. And so the notion here, that, of course, from the policy world is finding these easy-to-pull levers that are hard to reverse. And there's your graphics again. Easy-to-pull levers, hard to reverse, right? Is, we think, an appropriate way to proceed on the climate case. And we've got lots of people, again, Andy Jordan, Tony Zito, Frank Giel, Hoppen, Bernstein, a bunch of people working on this very question right now that I think our community can do a good job of actually helping out society with. But what's important for my talk, though, and I think that which confronts a lot of our existing assumptions, is that the methodological emphasis changes dramatically with type 4 problem solving. So we're now in this large N data-driven world, you know, large N data is better, we can be more sophisticated, right? But I want to argue that actually the priority disciplines and methods involving type 4 problem solving are actually the historical, the qualitative process tracing, the discursive policy analysis techniques, these things that actually are being undermined all around the world in the name of type 2 rigorous quantitative methods. Now, that's kind of provocative, but I think it's actually probably true, is the priority disciplines. These are the ones that actually matter more, methods rather, and the disciplines therefore are history, philosophy, law, historical sociology, and political science, some strands of geography. They're not getting the funding for the World Business Council and from Davos. They're not getting the funding. Yet these ones, I think, offer a lot of promise for thinking carefully about how to do this and to do it in an important way. So I want to argue, therefore, that we're getting policy conception drift that we need to be really aware of when thinking about how to proceed given type 4 problems if we care about them. And both power and methodological hegemony are to blame, both, okay? So think about this. In 1972, the United States was the leader of type 4 policy reforms. The Endangered Species Act says that you must list species that are threatened with endangerment or extinction, and you cannot take into account economic factors when doing so, just the science. This is the United States law, the United States, okay? Where I live right now, did that in 1972, right? And in 1992, my first research project, those laws had path-dependent effects. And when the science said to save this endangered species, the northern spotted owl, guess what? They did it, okay? And they undermined the logging industry, yes. The companies lost, but the owl won in a type 4 solution. This is not new. This is old type 4 thinking. We just don't do it anymore, but we used to do it a lot. 2019, it's all changed, right? Even the United Nations Environment Program, I would argue type 2 now dominates its thinking. It's about economic logics for addressing these ecological catastrophes. Utility is the solution, not the problem. World Economic Forum, type 2 totally. World Bank, type 2 totally. Even my own school, a professional environment school that was transformed in 72 to be type 4 is now, I would argue, type 2. And big data is driving our answers to our solutions. And even the new policy school at Yale is justified on the basis of getting type 2 big data answers to all of our questions, okay? It's dominating. Type 3 dominates United Nations, largely. Ever since Brundtland, you balance environmental, social, and economic goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are all type 3. They're in Newfoundland. Okay, the rhetoric is type 4, but their approach is type 3. Newfoundland, totally, okay? And so, therefore, it gets even more interesting because our own scholarly community has drifted. So this is David Victor is a really great political scientist, international relations on climate change. Fantastic work. This is his take on the Paris Accord. It transformed climate diplomacy from past gridlock by creating flexibility. So this is a pretty amazing positive take. And then he says in the same article, oh, but forget about the goals of the policy itself, okay? Which in our world, generally that's not how you think about transformation. We think about that being meeting the goals, okay? In this case, the accord itself is the more important focus than the actual goals. So how do you overcome policy consumption drift? Again, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and my time's up. So one drift is to acknowledge that the applied technical skills we teach, including multi-goal policy analysis, cost-benefit analysis, even scenario development, often implicitly reflect different moral philosophies about whether humans matter more than the environment and how to handle that problem. And they also prioritize different methods and disciplines and research priorities and funding opportunities over others, okay? And that has profound impacts for this drift that I think we need to confront and acknowledge. There's a huge risk that big data turn will actually prioritize type 2 over type 4 if we're not careful. So we've got to be vigilant about this challenge. And to do that, I think, therefore, when we do our research, if we're going to be applied at all, and I think there's a moral reason why we should be applied on this question, we've got to begin and end with problem conception assessments. So I'm not arguing that we must embrace type 4 problem solving since society and policymakers may decide not to. That's up to them, right? I'm saying that if we want to address type 4 problems, and I certainly think there's a moral compelling reason to do so, then we've got to guard against conception drift. When reflecting on our explanatory projects over the next 10 years, what do we want to do in the next 10 years? Is big data really the answer? And secondly, about decisions about how to teach and apply forward-looking policy analysis. Okay, I've done being provocative. My talk is now over, okay?